Me, as they said, my name is Heidi Campbell. I'm an associate professor of communication at Texas A&M University. Intersection between new media, religion, and digital culture since the mid-1990s. So, in an age where the internet looked like a library with all the books thrown on the floor, I was spending time in bulletin boards and news groups and email groups, trying to see how people were building online community and different expressions of churches online, and how that was impacting people's perceptions theologically and sociologically of what it meant to be part of a Christian community. So over the last 15 years, I've studied a lot of different things as different technologies have moved on. So looked at anything from the rise of the kosher cell phone in Israel, and looking at how religious communities, especially that are quite conservative or have tight boundaries, have kind of tried to innovate technologies in line with those values. I've done studies of Islamo gaming, so kind of alternative narratives that Muslims have used to kind of present themselves in popular culture. And I've also done work, my most recent work is looking at what I call digital creatives, and how they are emerging as new religious interpreters and leaders in many respects. And so last fall, I was at a conference in Finland, and that's where I met Keith, who's part of the Mobile Ministry Forum, and we had several great conversations. And so I'm thinking kind of my invitation to come today was based on that initial reaction. So if you could change to the next slide. I apologize that because of technology, you're not actually able to physically see me. But if you ever were seeing me more in an academic context, this is something what I'd look like. This is me actually talking on similar things I'm going to share with you today, but in Barcelona in April. And so I'm an academic, but I also have a real heart for kind of interpreting my more dense research into more practical ways. And so to that end, I'm actually working with a colleague of mine who's a theologian, and we're writing a book, Networked Theology. So what I'm sharing today, again, is kind of based on academic work, but trying to kind of translate it to audience to say, what have scholars like myself learned about religion online, and how that might be helpful for people trying to integrate digital and mobile strategies into their ministries. So if you move to the third slide, you'll see a picture of two books, and this is just a kind of a little bit of shameless self publicity, but just to kind of say that these are the kind of things that I've been working on in the last couple of years. The first picture is of digital religion, and this is a book that came out just a few months ago, and this is an edited collection that really surveys what scholars like myself have learned about religious practice online over the last 15 years or so. And then the second book, When Religion Meets New Media, is a more detailed study that I did comparing Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities' uses of new technologies and the ways that they developed negotiation strategies for technologies, and looking at the similarities and differences in those traditions. So that gives you a little more perspective. And finally, if you can move on to slide 4, you'll see a screenshot of a website. This is the Network for New Media, Religion, and Digital Culture Studies, and this is an interactive website that I run, mostly for kind of scholars, but it basically is kind of the hub for all research that's done related to new media and religion that's out there. And so there's a searchable bibliography, and there's information on upcoming conferences, as well as people that are working in this area. So if people are looking more for some of the research and statistics and stuff, this is a great place to kind of find out who's doing what, as well as kind of reading just what people have learned over the last 2 decades of study of this area. And so that brings me up to what I want to talk about today. So if you look at the next slide, this presentation is based on an article that came out in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, which was titled Understanding the Relationship Between Religious Practice Online and Offline in Network Society. And this article was an attempt for me to kind of look at, to say, what have scholars truly learned based on research about how people practice religion online? And what is the connection between religion online and religion offline? There was a lot of fears in the early days, especially when I started my work, that people were going to plug in, log on, and drop out of institutional religion because of the internet. And the fact is that that's just not the case. But as the internet has become embedded in our everyday lives, there's a really interesting kind of push toward trying to integrating online and offline spaces. And so this article is an attempt to try to get a handle on some of those findings. And if you go to the next slide, in this article, I kind of put forth this concept of what I call networked religion. And the idea of the network, and the idea that we live in these social networks that are loosely bounded and that are varying in size and shape, and that we often belong to multiple social networks at any one time that are facilitated through technology. That's not a very radical idea in the 21st century. But 15 years ago, that was a pretty new kind of concept. And so this idea of how our technologies connect us and how that creates certain patterns of socialization has become an important way for people to talk about government, to talk about education, to talk about things like globalization. And I would argue that the idea of the network, or what some people like Manuel Castells calls the network society, that it introduces this real sense of connectivity and fluidity in contemporary culture, has redefined a lot of areas of interaction, and including religion. So, Manuel Castells, when he was writing up in '96 about the network society, he argued that social relations are increasingly decentralized and interconnected through this social technical infrastructure, and that infrastructure becomes a template not just of how people function, but even just the reality of how they think about relations and even spiritual relationships. And so I'm arguing that network religion represents this loosening and representation of these traditional boundaries and communities, and often things that were very kind of clearly defined in geographic terms or theological terms have gotten turned on their head as the internet and as digital technologies have allowed for more dynamic and fluid forms of affiliation and practice. So that's kind of that's the kind of the theoretical idea behind the article. But what I put forward, if you can move on to the next slide, that when I defined the concept of network religion, I said that there's basically 5 kind of key characteristics that define what network religion looks like. So this is how people practice religion online. But I also would argue that not only is this how people practice religion online, but we're also seeing implications and images of this offline as well. And so I argue that network religion is this concept is supported by these ideas of convergent practice. That people, when they practice religion online, it's a very personalized experience, and it also encourages the blending from multiple sources and multiple contexts, information, and rituals. And also, when people have networked religion, it has this kind of sense of multi-site reality. The idea is that the people don't just practice religion online; they're trying to connect the online and offline, and this embeddedness and trying to create these bridges between these spaces to create one fluid space has some interesting implications for churches and spirituality. Thirdly, that network religion encapsulates this idea of network community, which I already talked about briefly. That communities are much more loosely bounded, where churches used to be defined in terms of geography or family ties. They're defined in a different way, and so that is changing the social cohesion and social formation of communities and spirituality. The 4th characteristic is storied identity, and here people, how they present their religious identity is much more based on a fluid and dynamic construction, and rather than more a static kind of identity construction. And finally, networked religion is defined by this sense of shifting authority, that the internet is both challenging traditional religious leaders and structures, but it's also empowering them at the same time. So we see this real sense that religious, especially organizations, are having to renegotiate their place in the digital culture because of both the empowerment and challenges that they face. So what I want to do right now is just going to look more briefly at 3 of these concepts. We can't look at all of them in detail because of time, but I want to talk about more specifically how these the concepts of convergent practice, multi-site reality, and then storied identity get lived out in the digital space, and what implications this might have for digital and mobile ministry. So if you could turn to the next slide, and that should give a definition of convergent practice. So convergent practice, it basically it recognizes that the internet serves for many people as a spiritual hub, allowing them to assemble and personalize their religious behavior and belief. So what this means is that the internet, because of the whole idea of kind of surfing and hyperlink culture that encourages moving from one source of information to another and kind of creating a web of connections rather than just one source, really encourages this idea of kind of assembling a reality or assembling bits of information or rituals from multiple places. And so what this really encourages is what people in religious studies call a pick and mix approach. And I don't know how some of you remember. It used to be you would go into maybe the local drugstore, and there would be this big candy display, and it had all these different candies, and you got your little bag, and you pick and mix and put them together, your own little connection of sugar goodness. And that's the kind of idea that the internet encourages, that it presents this reservoir of possibilities and resources, and people are encouraged to go to multiple places. So what this means is that not only are they looking even just within Christianity, but it also really encourages picking and mixing between traditions, between kinds of information. And so the online environment then encourages really individualized information gathering as well as practices and interpretation, because the only things that's consistent in that process is that the individual is kind of the hub or the gateway. You are your own decision maker. You're not going to, religious authorities outside or a Sunday school teacher or organization. And so this creates a lot more freedom for the individual outside the organization or like a denomination, but also challenges. So if you go to the next slide, one of the ways that we're seeing both kind of in digital culture and offline culture is that many of our kind of traditional religious rituals are becoming a mixture of sacred and secular practices and meanings. And this is especially seen if you kind of spend any time looking at kind of memorial sites, whether it be, there's cyber cemeteries where you can create a memorial to your pet, or creating kind of virtual tributes to a loved one. And so, it used to be that kind of funerals and memorials were kind of something that happened through the church, and there was kind of theological instruction and kind of places to process and grieve in a more institutional way. But now, people, as religion is not playing as much of a central role for many people, that these kind of memorializations have taken on a secular and a sacred meaning. And so, online allows people to kind of pick and mix in the language that they use and the kind of symbols they use in those kind of tributes, as well as kind of just even the using pop culture songs to interpret, kind of the grieving process or to make sense, especially in the community, such as like when a celebrity dies, like Michael Jackson a few years back. So if we move on to the next slide, what this means is that the convergent practice creates a lot of new possibilities, but tensions for people in online ministry. Because what this means is that people seeking to offer guidance and instruction are faced with an audience who draw on spiritual wisdom and practices from multiple sources and traditions. So, how do you garner the user's attention to one particular source of knowledge when they're encouraged to look in multiple places? And how do you kind of, teach orthodoxy or to put boundaries on that kind of information gathering or just religious interpretation? So the issue of kind of stickiness, getting people to stick with, one tradition or one kind of context becomes a real challenge. And just how do you kind of provide guidelines for just religious interpretation in this kind of a multiple, diverse, bricolage kind of sphere of meaning making? So let's move next to the concept of multi-site reality, and so if you could move to the next slide. So multi-site reality is, again, this recognition of the interconnectedness and embeddedness of the online and offline context. So what that means is that, again, people don't live, just in the online or just the offline, that they live in these multiple sites simultaneously. And so that there's a sense that people are trying to kind of create bridges of connection. So websites, religious apps especially can become a place to kind of, connect, your spirituality in the 24/7. Become a bridge in order to kind of, having your Bible reading accessible for when you're sitting on, the train. being able to kind of access, digital resources to help you think or pray or connect with spiritual like minds becomes really important. And so one of the things we recognize is that that the internet, while it's unique and the digital culture is unique in many respects, that religious spaces online don't just emerge in a vacuum. They're usually created by a user and a group that is informed by a certain theology or a certain background, and so that these online spaces and digital spaces are consciously and unconsciously imprinted by the user's community values. So that becomes important to recognize that while the digital allows for innovation, there's also a sense that people need to be conscious about how they're bringing their values. And this becomes especially important when you have collaborative works where people might not realize kind of the underlying values are coming from multiple places as they're creating those spaces. And also it's important to recognize that religious users and innovators seek to integrate the spaces and create ideological overlap. So many people, there's people. There's always a tension online. Do you create the one-stop shop, the kind of mega hub space where people can do multiple things online, or do you create a specialized app or digital space that allows people just to do one thing and do it well? But whichever strategy you go for, it's always important to recognize that people are looking to connect, and between online and offline spaces, they want something that allows them to share that information with maybe friends or family, or to kind of access it in multiple ways. And so, creating closed-bounded spaces can become problematic. And one of the ways, and if you could turn to the next slide, that we've seen this as far as really in unique experimentation with kind of blending the online and offline is in multi-site churches. And so one group that I've studied quite a bit is Northland. Their slogan is "A Church Distributed." They're a church based in the Orlando area in Florida. So they have, the physical kind of parent church, but they also have multiple site locations that you can attend on a Sunday that are webcast from the main parent congregation. They have a Facebook congregation, an internet, a virtual kind of chat room congregation. They have kind of a Roku channel as well. And so, and the multi-site churches movement is in many ways a response to the megachurch movement of the 80s, which many people found to be very depersonalized and disconnected. And so the multi-site church was an attempt to kind of create smaller spaces where people could have more interaction and build community more. And so multi-site churches are heavily technologically driven enterprises because they have to try to connect these congregations, and often they're live webcast or from the different services. But they're also experiencing different challenges of how does that change, the liturgy of the church services when you are trying to mediate the experience in multiple places. What does it do theologically for people's understanding of the body of Christ? And, if you have people in your congregation that are primarily, meeting online and not face-to-face, how does that change or reshape your understanding of Christian community? So many of the questions that these churches and groups are dealing with is really about this idea of connection, like how do we see community? And the idea of online church has been a hugely debated concept within many theological traditions because they see mediation as less than. But especially in a day and age where our lives are becoming more and more mediated, for many young people, this isn't it's maybe theologically is problematic, but in practicality it's not problematic for them at all. And so we see different levels of tension between religious leaders and theologians versus the actual people who are practicing their faith in these mediated and multi-site spaces. So if we move to the next slide, what I'm trying to argue is that that people live in this multi-site reality in a digital culture, and that creates some certain sense of tensions because for many people the offline context may no longer serve as the primary source of spiritual connection and knowledge. So what that means is that, while these digital spaces are imprinted with the values and understandings of a particular tradition or community or set of people, that when they get transported into media environments, people may see that the offline is something that's important, but maybe the online space is where it was what they would call home. And so this becomes a challenge for especially people doing digital and mobile ministry to think through, to what extent do the services we offer, the kind of mission strategies we offer, do we need to think more practically about how we integrate or connect these realities? In online education, the term a lot is used about blending, so blending realities, and how do we so it's not just even a point-to-point connection, but that there's a seamless flow between the spaces. And so theologically, this is the issue that theologians are now talking about of how do we understand a blended, multi-sided digital reality for the church and church ministry. The last trait I want to talk about is that of storied identity, and I think this is really important, especially people who are doing mobile ministry, because this is all about how do people understand their religious identity and build their religious identity in digital culture. And the argument is that identity we used to think about religious identity as something you kind of took on. You went through catechism or Sunday school, and you learned the stories and you learned the values, and then you kind of like putting on a jacket or putting on a new outfit. You actually took on that identity, and that was it. But most sociologists recognize that people rarely do that nowadays, that in contemporary society it's more common that people construct or perform their identities, so that identity is much more malleable, that it changes over time, and that people are always put in spaces where they need to kind of perform and self-present. And this is especially true in digital culture. Every time we join a new social media platform, we're asked to define ourselves, our religiosity, who we want to be in those spaces by the taglines, by the pictures we put up. And so this kind of process of kind of creating identity and performing a religious identity becomes much more pronounced, because we've always had to do this, but we're now forced to do it in a much more, especially visual way. So identity online is enacted through this process of self-identification and negotiation, where people are having to make choices. And the challenge is especially that we're not, people aren't usually taught in church or Sunday school how do they will know you are Christians by your login, by your images on Instagram. Teaching kind of visual education and visual media literacy becomes important because it's such a key part of religious identity. And also this means that the digital culture gives new possibilities for people to experiment or present their religious identities, especially in generations past where, it would only be maybe the pastor or people in leadership that would have a public platform to present what it means to be a Christian. But now we're all able to do that very quickly and easily in multiple contexts. So if you move to the next slide, one of the ways that this has been seen really pronounced in the last decade is in the area of blogging and religious blogging. So, people in just the kind of the taglines that they use about how they frame their blog are making really interesting theological statements about how they understand what it means to be a Christian in the digital world, and especially the idea of being able to show the struggle that people may face in regards to different theological issues or maybe disagreements they have with a certain stance or tradition, or being able to kind of highlight specific issues that they're passionate about. And so the Internet becomes an important space for people to create this storied identity, to basically present their version of what they think Christianity is, and to try to connect and weave together a certain narrative that hopefully other people can connect to, either to join them in their personal kind of journey of, becoming spiritually aware, or even being used as a platform for religious education and preaching in many respects. So the Internet gives these possibilities, and again, people are doing this individually rather than under the guidance of, religious leaders or an accountability network in many respects. So if we could turn to the next slide, this raises a lot of tensions for, religious organizations and people doing mobile ministry, because religious identity becomes very flexible and highly personalized. And so that means that people, even if you're all using the same platform or even connected through the same network, you may have very different understandings of what it means to be a Christian or how Christianity should be expressed in the digital realm. And so the challenge becomes is how do we kind of both model that as well as kind of educate, especially young people, in presenting their religious identities or giving kind of boundaries or guidance. Meaning making online is really about, remix and mashups. It's about basically looking at the reservoir of possibilities out there and assembling them into our own story, our own image. So digital storytelling becomes a very interesting and powerful way to kind of present religious identity, but also one that needs to be kind of, I believe, cultured and kind of guided in many respects. So if we can turn to the very last slide, I just want to leave with kind of what I see as some of the interesting impacts that network religion has on digital and mobile ministry. And these are especially two concepts that I've been talking with different people this summer with as I've gone to different meetings and conferences. So one thing I would argue is that we need to kind of think seriously and critically the extent to which mobile online ministry is blended and bridges or supplements offline ministry in the church. For some people, what they find online as far as interaction, maybe religious debate or kind of Bible learning, it might be way more vibrant than what they actually experience in their church, or there might not even be opportunities for debate or Bible study there. And so what happens if we create these resources or spaces for people to do that, but then that's not mirrored in the offline church? Are we going to then encourage people to kind of gravitate toward more mediated interactions rather than offline interactions? Or if maybe if you are lucky and you're part of an organization or faith community that does a lot with social media and does try to do that bridging, to what extent are there some things about Christian practice learning that we should encourage to be much more embodied, related to prayer or related to religious study, that encouraging them to done in a media context actually might be taking away from the essence of what that tradition, what that ritual, what that practice is supposed to be at its heart. And the second point is, how does mobile ministry address or deal with this tendency towards networked individualism and diminishing of traditional forms of affiliation membership? So networked individualism is a concept that's been talked about by scholars like Barry Wellman. And again, this gets into the idea that at the network, it used to be the family, the institution, or the geography that was the center of community. But in a network society, it's the individual who's the center point. I create my own ego-centered network, that kind of where I connect my spiritual network to my friendship network to my work-related network. And so the kind of check and balance system isn't something the community or the institution, it's myself. And so again, this gives lots of new opportunities that weren't available before, but then it also means that there's a less sense of accountability. And so if a lot of digital practice is encouraging, the individual to be in control and not to refer to those outside them to the larger community, what potential implications does that have? Is that going to encourage people to kind of step away from offline affiliation because the offline church doesn't offer the opportunities or vibrancy that the online does? So those are just some issues I think that this kind of research that I've tried to present really briefly opens up. And I hope this has given a couple points for maybe conversation or question that we can have together. So thank you.
Hello, I'm here. Well, thank you very much, Heidi. That was thought-provoking, to say the least. And I'm going to say that at this point, we are going to just open it up, dive right into questions, comments, and let people pitch in as much as they can. Heidi is going to be on the phone listening to you, but because she cannot see who's saying what, we would ask that if you do have a question, we're going to let Clyde unmute you. So if you're on the phone, then please, or if you're on the internet, which most of you are, there's very few of that are actually on the phone. In the chat or the participants box, there's a little hand down at the bottom to raise your hand. And if you have a question or comment, please raise your hand and Clyde will unmute you. And we'll let you know that you're free to ask your question. Just announce who you are, please, so that Heidi knows who she's talking to. And let's go.
And we've got 3 questions already in the chat box if you want to start with those, Benjamin.
Yeah, let me take a look at those. Chat's not open right now. Okay.
And the first one's from Dave Hackett down there at the bottom.
Yeah, okay. So David Hackett says, not only high church or liturgical, but also low church, I would think, would feel threatened by this remix and mashup trend. How are they responding to this negativity or positivity?
Well, I mean, that's obviously a really broad question, but I know that, and is he referring to kind of networked individualism, or which trend was that?
Go ahead, Dave. Dave, I unmuted you, bro.
Sure. Am I on now?
You're on.
Okay, good. Hi, Heidi.
Hi.
Yeah, it's on the sense of with this individualized aspect that you mentioned, and as people mix and mash up and create their own, like your great phrase, the sugar goodness of going into a candy store. So I'm wondering how you are observing or hearing of churches across the range of styles, denominations, responding to this rise of this individualized, the growth of this individualized nature that's coming.
Yeah, I think, well, one of the ways that churches are responding, and these are, again, probably more in denominational rather than individual churches, but is kind of developing either kind of, education programs or kind of even policy statements related to digital culture and trying to connect that with their values. So I think churches are becoming aware that realize that in many ways churches are often the late bloomers, coming to the party, as it were. And so, they're now trying to get a handle on, okay, this is the values of digital culture, and how does that mesh with the values of our denomination or organization? And so I've seen some groups that are starting to develop, religious education, Sunday school curriculum programs, or kind of even like social media boot camps that are both practical, trying to get pastors to use Facebook or Twitter and teaching them how to do that, but also getting to think about, okay, what is your mission as a pastor, and how and what ways do the values of this technology maybe complement or challenge that? So I think a lot of it is just kind of, first step has been awareness. Second step has been some people are developing some actual programs, and the third step is some groups seeing the need for kind of policy/education value statements related to new media. But I think a lot of people they kind of think, well, digital culture doesn't touch us because we're just not using it. But the thing is, you don't have to use digital technology for it to reshape the whole culture of your church. Even if you opt out, it's still impacting you. And I think now people are just beginning to recognize that is an issue, so that they have to deal with it.
Dave, any more comments or to that?
No, I think that's really true. It's impacting all over, left and right, and people, you can't opt out because even the grandmothers are using it. Thanks.
Something that Clyde, the next question that we've got in the chat was from Clyde, and asking how do we help provide guidance, as it were, in this world of storied identity, storied identity. And in a way, I think your previous answer kind of deals with that. But maybe you have something more specific to say, right? Clyde, does that answer that question, or?
Well, yeah, I'm just curious, Heidi, and I think it was under the storied identity part, as you said, yeah, we need to provide guidance as people, or I guess, and I'm like, how do we do that? Like, double click on that.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, most of my work has been done with kind of like religious denominations and churches at this point. So that's what I'm going to kind of speak to. So some of these things may not be as easy to implement for like a mobile ministry or organization. But I think a lot of it is religious. Working in with religious education and media literacy needs to be much more part of our Sunday school curriculums and in our sermons. I think to understand kind of just how. Just recognizing that, a lot of the theological concepts and assumptions we have about what constitutes community, how people accept identity, the idea of catechism. You go through catechism, you say a vow, and then you've just absorbed all that meaning and theology and history, and you're just going to try your best to live it out. But I think people, do a lot more there's a lot more skeptics, a lot more struggling, and I think that people don't see that as a kind of I take the blue pill and now I'm a Methodist. So I think that kind of recognizing that and creating more spaces for conversation, creating more training materials, and especially for young people who are already going through that process of trying to say who am I and what does it mean to be a person of faith, is that talking about these things and talking about how digital culture can be used either positively or negatively. Experiment with our religious identity can be used to do those things becomes really important.
Excellent. Thank you.
Something, I'll throw this in there just as a thought, something that I see a lot of people doing is taking something that already exists necessarily in an offline way and trying to adapt it to fit an online framework and model. And sometimes I think that works, but I think as a general rule, that may not be the best approach. We have to consider that an online or networked religion is interconnectivity of every part of the life that you've shaped for yourself, and this control that we give in a virtual world to people affects how especially the younger generations who've never lived without this, the Gen Xers and the so on, or the Gen Y, and so on and so forth. But I think that the challenge comes in when we have to make our approach completely different than the way we look at things offline. If it's offline, it's offline, and may or may not work for online. But if it's online, there's a different approach to that. And I've heard a lot of different cases and examples of that. So just a comment. Third question that we've got is from Keith Williams. And he says, one of the ways we see mobile religion worked out in small groupings of believers coming together to view or listen to media on a mobile device and then responding to it as a group. This has precedent in radio and TV outreach. Any thoughts on new media use in group settings like this?
Yeah, and I think this is where we kind of really need to kind of know your audience, because obviously the way that somebody maybe people in kind of Europe versus America versus Africa, they're going to deal with they're going to A, have access to different kinds of mobile technology, and B, they're going to interact with it possibly in different ways. So in media studies we talk about narrowcasting, about how knowing your audience and kind of creating products or creating kind of messages that really understand those cultural values. And so I think for some people, mobile culture has been this great space because look at this video on YouTube, look at this kind of Instagram image, sit around the coffee shop and talk about that. And so for some groups and subcultures, mobile media has become this almost like back around the radio, this kind of a communal experience. But for other people, it's a very highly individualized experience, and there may be sharing, but that sharing is happening through maybe me sending an image to another device, rather than actually an embodied experience. And so I think that's, again, understanding, like, if you're creating an app or creating a mobile website, understanding, like, okay, who is your target audience, and how are they going to engage with this, or how do you want them to engage with this, and then thinking about that seriously. So it's just as much about kind of more strategic thinking in design as there is with the theological or kind of the kind of communal values that you want to cultivate through that as well.
Good. Keith, anything to add to that?
Not at all. Great stuff. Thank you, Heidi.
All right. That's what we've got for questions. Are there any other hands up or any other people that would like to comment? Or
I'm just going to unmute everybody, so you kind of control the best you can, Benjamin, but the floor is open.
All right. If you have something to say, please just announce yourself, and we'll go from there. Well, I have a question. Heidi, this is Benjamin again. When you've done your research and the different groups that you have worked with, do you find is there an eclectic range of ages that you're finding most of your research falls in? Like, I mean, the statistic we hear a lot is that, 90% of, and this is, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but 90% of youth leave the church after they graduate from high school, and so that's that's what we would call the digital natives, the online generation. They're leaving the offline church, and so I'm wondering how much of that generation and that audience, as it were, have been included in your research.
Yeah, I mean, well, a lot of what I look at is kind of how specific groups or institutions kind of use technology, and if you think about kind of pretty much what's reflected in my research is whoever would be in the pews are also usually the dominant users. So if you think of like the Church of England or the Methodist Church or whatnot, whatever their demographic is, usually is reflected in the users of the different websites, apps, platforms that they develop. And so one of the things that we're seeing is, in a lot of ways, is that people think, oh well, if we develop an online resource, then we're going to draw in young people. Well, not really. That's unfortunately not the fact. That actually you have to do something really geared toward young people and knowing what their kind of user preferences are, as well as kind of their spiritual preferences, in order to draw them in. And so, the one-size-fits-all kind of website or resources doesn't really work as a platform. And that's one of the challenges, because a lot of denomination organizations, they just want to build one thing and to fit everyone's needs. And in some ways, that's a great theological thing. The church is supposed to be for everyone. But the reality is, because digital culture is all about the individual and is about narrowcasting, that's not going to work. You have to build in multiple kind of options into that platform if you really want to reach the young people. And also it depends, because I've been in a lot of churches that are really media savvy. Like there's one church I've done ethnographic work in London, and it's like they don't expect anyone to bring a Bible. In fact, it'll be very hard to find a physical Bible in the church, but they just assume because it's London and the demographic of the church, everybody's going to have a smartphone, everybody will have an app. And if not, they actually hand out little cards to say, here's a couple apps that you should download so that you can read the scripture. And when it comes to the scripture reading, they say, okay, everyone pull out your smartphones. This and and they mostly use YouVersion. In YouVersion, this is what you're going to find, and da-da-da. And so they've kind of created a certain cultural expectation, because they just assume that young people are going to be engaging, and they expect people to be Instagramming and Facebooking during the service. In fact, they will have a Twitter fall, and they'll have Instagram space where people can post their pictures or images there. Now, that won't work for every congregation, but I think that's, at least for them, they've been very savvy to say, hey, this is how we can connect people and our population and keep young people engaged.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Well, digital silence is always the hardest kind of silence. So we have about 10 minutes left, but I'm not going to drag us out 10 minutes if there are no more comments or questions. So I'm going to say, Heidi, do you have any other closing thoughts? Anything else you could add or would add or recommend or?
The only thing else I would say that if people are interested in the kind of the paper, the academic paper that this is based on, I'd be more than happy to email it a PDF of it to them. So I'm very Googleable. So Heidi, if you Google Heidi Campbell in Texas, I should be the first hit. But my email is HeidiC@tamu.edu, and as well as I encourage again and I know what I presented today was a little bit probably more dense than practical, and so I'm always welcome for feedback as far as, because I am in the process of trying to do some more work of making this more user friendly and more and interpret it for a broader audience that can help people do their ministry, do their church work, do their religious education better. So I'm always grateful for comments, and if I can be of any help to anyone, just feel free to get in touch.
Great. Well, thank you. We do, for everybody who's still on and listening, I'm just I'll wrap us up here. We do make the recording of this available afterward. Clyde and I will work as soon as we're done here. He'll post this on the MMF blog with a recording of the session and with a kind of a mock-up of the notes that were taken, if any. The PowerPoint that we presented today will be there. And actually, Heidi, if you would like to send me the article or the paper that this work is based off of, if you want to email that to me, we can include that as a part of the blog. And so that is there for. We will also be sending out that information, a link to the blog and all of this information pretty soon, as soon as it gets up, and Clyde and I can get around to emailing it hopefully later this afternoon. So open up one more time for any more questions.
I'll just add a quick announcement. We don't have the details in terms of the website ready, but we do have our mobile ministry consultation dates announced. So if you are interested in meeting with 100 or more like-minded people, join us in Orlando, December 9th, 10th, and 11th. If you've signed up, I think we have your email. We'll make sure you get some communications regarding that. But save those dates: December 9th, 10th, and 11th in Orlando, Florida.
Great. Okay. Well, I'd like to, again, I unfortunately forgot to open our time up in prayer, but I would like to